I'm about to take you for a detailed tour over one of the largest projects that I have ever undertaken. The skills and individual processes found here on Engineer to Slide all come from my real-world experiences, and the majority of those are the lessons learned from the completion of projects such as my Spaceframe Toyota Hilux Drift Ute. This project began in my one-car garage in late 2010, and it took me 3.5 years to complete. Since then, I've enjoyed driving and displaying my creation both here in Australia and overseas. And if you're familiar with the build already, then you would have seen a lot of photos of it assembled with its body on. In this project, I've removed the shell so that we can get deeper into the build and find out what makes it work. Let's begin with the one component that ties everything together, the chassis. This chassis is known as a space frame. A space frame refers to the tube structure that is welded together to create a strong and rigid chassis. Now, this is unlike a regular car which uses the panels to create the strength and subsequent shape of the car. So when I set out to build this Hilux, I didn't have the space frame in mind, as I believed it was too far out of my skill level to complete. My plan was to pick up a Hilux cabin, a complete Nissan S15, and mate the Hilux body onto the Nissan S15 floor pan, which would house all of the standard components that would essentially make a Hilux competitive on the racetrack. It didn't take too long for this plan to derail though. I bought an S15, which is the black one that I'm building now, a Hilux cab, and then set about marking out the cut lines. It was at this point that I realised the changes that I would have to make and the unnecessary additions to the roll cage to tie everything in. This was going to add complexity and weight to the project, so before I cut up the S15, I had a slight rethink about things. I started researching tube frame chassis and the fabrication methods needed to make one. At this point, I had never TIG welded, bent tube or made anything structural. The more I learned from this research, the closer my goal became. I took the running gear out of the S15 chassis, put it into storage, and then set about making this chassis. The materials used here are all mild steel. If you want to get a better understanding of mild steel, then I suggest you head to our staple skills section, which goes into great detail. I chose mild steel because it's relatively cheap, it's easy to fabricate, and it's great to learn with. The tube used here is 1020 SAE grade cold drawn seamless mild steel, measuring 1.5 and 1.75 inch outside diameter with a wall thickness of 2.6 millimeters. I chose this after reading the regulations on roll cage structures and thought it would be the right material for my project. If it works in a rollover situation, then it will work for me. The design I chose had a lot to do with the Hilux cabin, the seating position, the front and rear cradles from the S15, and my proposed look. Initially, I ordered 60 meters of tube. I built my own tube bender and notcher, which you can find in our download section, purchased an entry-level AC/DC TIG welder, and then had my local metal fabrication company complete a frame jig to my dimensions. I needed this jig made as I didn't have a flat floor, and I wanted the project to be portable as I didn't have any room in my garage to move around it. I had a few older friends at the time that were great TIG welders, and they helped me set up my machine and do some test welds. After that, I grabbed a heap of ER70 S2 1.6mm filler rods, cut my tube with an angle grinder, bent it with my own tube bender, then notched and welded it to join the rear subframe to the front, all while creating a rollover structure inside the cabin. The floor is completely flat, and I use 75 by 20mm rectangle hollow section tube with a 1.6mm wall thickness to weld the tube to. This houses individual alloy floor plates that are tapped with stainless M5 screws, holding the floor pan onto the chassis. The strut tops were machined and drilled 360 degrees around to allow for plenty of adjustment, and I used a plumb bob and a tape measure to work out plenty of caster and camber into their location. Once I had all the chassis complete, I could start working on the smaller items. I learned a lot from TIG welding the entire chassis, and I wanted to try my hand at welding thinner metals with more strength. You can see this in the suspension arms that I've made. Up front, the suspension is all Nissan S15 items with modified knuckles, MCA coilovers, S13 steering rack and the chromoly arms. These measure 1.25 inch in diameter and have a wall thickness of 1.6 millimeters with mild steel bracing holding the caster rods. Out the back here, I have the same chromoly tube making up the multi-link suspension design with alloy Heim joints holding it all together and making it all adjustable. The rear coilovers were specially made by Murray Coote at MCA and work amazingly well. Incorporated into the chassis are 4 air jacks. These use 150 psi of nitrogen pressure to lift the 900 kilograms chassis into the air for easy servicing. Because this has a flat floor and all the tube is very thin, it's not easy to slide a trolley jack underneath and lift it up. The sway bars on this were a bit of an afterthought. Remember that I didn't draw anything on this car, it was all freehand, and this made a lot of things difficult. But I did get around most problems, and the sway bars were made possible by using some ex-V8 supercar blade adjustable ends that make the car very flat but also adjustable. So with that covered, let's take a look at the engine and its accessories, starting with the cooling package. This removable front end structure uses just 4 bolts to remove it and replace it from the chassis. We have a PWR intercooler made to my dimensions along with an oil cooler. This oil cooler connects to the engine via a Peterson oil filter with a pair of Jiffy Tight dry brake fittings that allow for spill-free removal. The intercooler is easily removable too with some Wiggins clamps that use an O-ring and outer sleeve design to lock together yet still allow for movement. I also have the entire front end bodywork attached to this removable front. The bumper removes with 4 ball lock pins made by Avibank, and the tube work holds the headlights, panels and ducting all in place. So with that covered, let's move back to the main chassis and check out the engine bay. Back here at the main chassis, we can see the radiator is at the front. This is also custom made by PWR and it uses a swirl pot to create a high fill point in the system. And all the fittings are from Earls along with the nylon braided hose that is super lightweight. The engine itself is from my previous 2-tone Nissan Silvia, which is now naturally aspirated. This motor came from that car and it has 9:1 compression, which is a built bottom end, Tomei Pro cams, solid lifters, Mazworks billet intake, has a TD06 20G L2 turbo on pump fuel, producing 336 rear wheel kilowatts. At the back of the SR20 engine and at the back of the engine bay, I incorporated the power steering fluid tank into the right hand side here and the oil air separator tank into the left hand side. This incorporates a neat little drain valve that I can access easily to make sure that the motor is healthy and not expelling too much oil after a track day. In the cabin here we have a lot of exposed steel, and like the rest of the chassis, I had the chassis powder coated clear. And although it still looks great in spots, it does have a small amount of internal moisture that you can see under the clear. This presents as rust and it was never going to last forever, but it has been worth the effort to see all of the weld marks and fabrication that went into it. Inside the transmission tunnel hides a Quaife QBE 69G 6-speed sequential gearbox, and this allows clutchless upshifts and makes a hell of a lot of noise inside the cabin due to the straight cut nature of the gears. The seats are Bright Vios items that I also stole from my Nissan 2-tone S13 Silvia. I use a Nardi suede wheel, and behind that is a race pack dash that gets power from a race pack PDM and switches through a roof mounted race pack switch panel. This powers a Link G4 ECU which sits above it and controls the engine through a mil-spec wiring harness. Out the back, the alloy tank houses the fuel, and this fuel goes through the Peterson fuel filter before being pressurised by the Bosch 044 fuel pump. The fuel then runs through the cabin, under the driver's feet, inside the tubes with AN fittings welded on either end. Speaking of feet, I have fitted a Wilwood top mount pedal box with incorporated master cylinders and plumbed these through the firewall. These then run into dry brake fittings to send the fluid to the alloy R32 Skyline brakes. Under the Skyline R33 GDR rear end is an under tray that doubles as an air diffuser and a mount for the fiberglass rear guards. The frame is mild steel and it holds aluminium sheet with 4 flaps guiding the air from the flat floor out behind the rear tub. The 3-inch exhaust gases pass through this and it slips out into a pair of 80mm aluminium tips. The tub itself is made from fiberglass panels, and these were hand moulded with my 2700mm wheelbase, which is 150mm longer than an S15 Silvia and 150mm shorter than a normal Toyota Hilux. Both front and rear guards are wider by 80mm than factory, and these fit the Driftmaster wheels inside them. These measure 17 by 9 at the front and 18 by 9.5 at the rear with 0 offset. Apart from the outer body shell itself and the doors, there really isn't much Hilux left. The outer cabin here is significantly cut away and it's really only used to hold the doors and windscreen in place. The front windscreen is a standard glass item, and on the rear I've used 3mm polycarbonate Lexan drilled and tapped into the body using M4 stainless screws. The mirrors on the doors are made from carbon fibre and the standard door handles are shaved away with patches welded in. I've come up with a really simple solution that uses small aluminium handles connected with aluminium TIG filler rods that can be actuated from inside or outside the vehicle. The cabin's roof is smoothed over with a strip of sheet metal tack welded into the gutter trays, and the whole body is painted in factory Toyota white to give it a very subtle overall look. The one thing I will point out is the door hinges have been cut in half and the pins filed to a point to allow the doors to slip on and off the body. If you plan on doing this, make sure you leave the bottom pin longer than the top so that you can locate the door first before positioning the top pin. It's a nightmare getting them both to line up together at the same time, and by keeping the bottom one longer than the top, it will allow you to line it up. The body slips over the chassis and it uses 6 M8 bolts drilled into the pinch mouldings on the body, which are tapped into the floor pan. If I did this again, I would remove these pinch mouldings to gain some extra floor clearance and then have a 90-degree return that screws into the floor pan. Apart from the outer body shell itself and the doors, there isn't really much Hilux left. Looking back at my initial intentions to weld a Hilux cab on an S15 chassis, things have really snowballed, but for the better. I learned a lot of lessons from this build. Of course, there are the obvious fabrication lessons such as measuring, cutting, bending, grinding, filing and welding, just to name a few, but others are not so apparent. I'm talking about the inspiration that is needed to push forth with projects such as this. I worked a full-time job and spent most of my income and time working on this over that 3.5-year period that it took to complete it. With every component, I would research each part of the build and look what other motorsport disciplines would use and how they overcame the same problems. This led me to use a lot of second-hand race parts from disciplines such as Speedway, V8 supercars and NASCARs, just to name a few. By doing this, I was able to keep my budget low, but quality high. The most difficult part of the build was the ever-changing parts list and the adaptation of that onto the chassis. I am planning another space frame build similar to this in the future, but this time I want all the components placed around the chassis jig prior to starting any tube work. This way it will reduce complexity and allow me to incorporate all the components into the chassis with minimal additions, and this will save me time and weight and allow the chassis to be optimized for the application. So if you're considering doing something similar, then I would suggest breaking down the project into smaller individual parts, starting with a stock front and rear subframe, an outer shell, an intended wheelbase dimension, a chassis jig, a pair of seats and a set of wheels to really allow you to see the vision and get an idea for the chassis fabrication that is needed. It's been one hell of a build. Sure, there's a lot of things that I would change if I had the chance, but as it stands, it's an indication that anything is possible if you put your mind to it. Thanks for checking out this project, and if you're looking for more information on the materials and skills used to construct a project like this, then make sure you head on over to our skills section where we break it all down in easy to follow individual processes.